You think she's just another quiet girl, don't you? The professor's voice echoed through the lecture hall, dripping with mockery. Let's see if she can solve this impossible calculus problem. The entire room turned towards Emma, the quiet girl sitting in the back. She hadn't said a word all semester, her presence barely noticed. With her long brown hair tucked behind her ears, she scribbled absent-mindedly in her notebook. No one thought she could be anything more than a passive student, maybe even a little slow. But the professor, with his smug smirk, had no idea what he was about to provoke. He wrote the complicated equation on the board, something that even the best students in the class struggled with. Come on, Emma. You can't possibly solve this, he challenged, his voice filled with arrogance. The class chuckled. Emma's face remained calm, but inside, something shifted. Her hands, usually steady, now clenched. She took a deep breath, letting the numbers swirl around in her mind. She had been quietly practicing this. These kinds of problems were her specialty. She had solved equations like this in her sleep. Still, the doubt in the room felt suffocating. They thought she would fail. Emma stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor, the sound catching everyone's attention. She walked to the front of the room without saying a word, the eyes of every student fixed on her. She picked up the chalk, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she remained composed. The professor's smirk only deepened as he folded his arms. Go ahead, he said, with a wave of his hand. Show us what you've got. With a single stroke, Emma began to write. The classroom fell into an eerie silence, every student watching in disbelief as she moved with a quiet confidence, solving the equation step by step, flawlessly. Her hand moved faster, but each calculation was precise. She didn't pause. The numbers seemed to dance in front of her, falling into place as if they were meant to be. The professor's eyes widened, his smug expression faltering. He glanced at the other students, unsure of what to make of this. Emma was solving it too quickly, too perfectly. The entire room was stunned into silence. No one dared to speak. Emma finished the equation, stepped back from the board, and placed the chalk down with a soft click. The room remained still, the air thick with shock. Professor Harrington opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eyes were locked on the board, unable to comprehend how this simple, quiet girl had just solved what he thought was an impossible problem. He turned to the class, searching for some sign of an answer, but the students were just as stunned. The girl they had underestimated, the girl they had laughed at, had just proven them all wrong. Emma turned, her expression calm, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She walked back to her seat, her movements graceful and assured. The class remained frozen in disbelief. Professor Harrington slowly lowered his arms, his confidence shattered. What happened next would leave him speechless. The room was still, as if time itself had stopped. Professor Harrington stood frozen, his mind racing to process what had just happened. His usual confidence, built on years of teaching and experience, had shattered in an instant. Emma, the quiet girl who barely spoke in class, had just done what no one thought was possible. The equation he had presented, which had stumped the brightest minds in the room, was now solved in front of him, effortlessly and flawlessly. The murmurs in the room began to grow louder as students exchanged confused glances. Emma sat back in her seat, her face calm and composed, as though nothing extraordinary had just transpired. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if she were simply going through her usual routine. But to those who had been watching, this was far from ordinary. The professor stood at the board, staring at the equation as if hoping the numbers would change. He had seen brilliant students, but this was something else. Emma wasn't just talented. She was a genius, a prodigy in a way that couldn't be ignored. He couldn't understand how he had misjudged her. How could he have overlooked someone with this level of brilliance? He looked at her again, trying to make sense of it all, but the more he thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed that he had ever doubted her. His arrogance, his dismissal of her, had clouded his judgment. He had been so sure that she was just another student who would blend into the background. But Emma had just proven him completely wrong. The room was silent. Everyone too stunned to speak. Finally, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "Professor, how did she do that?" It was one of the students, a top math major, his voice filled with awe. The professor's eyes flickered with frustration. He had no answer. He had been the one who had challenged her, and now he was the one who was speechless. Emma, on the other hand, seemed unfazed by the attention. She didn't need anyone's approval. She didn't need to explain herself. The solution had been simple to her, a puzzle she had solved with ease. Her mind had been calm, her focus unshakable. It was a moment of clarity, a moment where everything fell into place. As the professor turned to face the class, he realized something that made his heart sink. He had underestimated her. And now, he had to live with the fact that Emma, the quiet girl in the back of the room, had just outshone him. His reputation, built over years of teaching, was now in question. The students, once loyal followers of his every word, were now questioning his authority. Emma's calm demeanor only made the situation worse for him. The more he tried to salvage his pride, the worse it got. "Emma," he said finally, his voice shaky. "How did you do it?" She looked at him, her expression unchanged. "I just solved it," she replied simply, her tone neutral. No arrogance, no boastfulness, just a simple statement of fact. The professor didn't know how to respond. He had expected her to fail, to stumble under the pressure. But she hadn't. Instead, she had made him look foolish. The class was still silent, waiting for some sort of reaction. But there was nothing more to say. Emma had already said everything with her actions. The professor stood there, speechless, as Emma returned to her seat, the room still in shock. For the first time in a long time, the professor realized he wasn't the smartest person in the room. The professor stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. His mind raced as the reality of Emma's brilliance sank in. He had always prided himself on being the smartest in the room, the one who could challenge students and watch them struggle. But Emma, the quiet girl in the back, had just outperformed him in front of the entire class. It was more than just the shock of the moment. It was the realization that he had misjudged her from the very beginning. The class, too, seemed to be caught in a trance. They had never seen this side of Emma before. For the first time, they truly saw her, not as the quiet girl who sat at the back of the room, but as someone far more capable than any of them had ever imagined. The students exchanged looks, whispers beginning to ripple through the room. "Did you see that?" one of them muttered. "She just solved that like it was nothing." Another added, "I can't believe we didn't see it before." Emma, however, didn't respond. She was used to this. The silence around her was nothing new. She had spent her entire life blending into the background, never seeking attention, never craving validation. She was here to learn, not to prove anything to anyone. But today, the truth had come to light. She had been underestimated for too long, not just by her classmates, but by the very person who was supposed to teach her. The professor, his face flushed with embarrassment, finally cleared his throat and turned to face the class. "Well," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "it seems I was wrong." The students fell silent, waiting for him to say more. But what could he say? How could he justify his earlier actions? How could he explain the mistake he had made in front of all of them? There was nothing he could say. "Emma," he spoke again, this time softer. You've proven me wrong." She nodded slowly, her expression still neutral. "It's just math," she said quietly, her voice calm and composed. "It's just a matter of understanding the problem and finding a solution." The class was still in shock. No one had expected this level of humility from her. Emma wasn't boasting about her genius. She wasn't asking for praise. She had simply done what she was capable of, with no desire for recognition. As the class started to process what had just happened, the professor slowly took a step back. The room, which had been filled with whispers and murmurs just moments before, had now fallen into an awkward, uncomfortable silence. Professor Harrington couldn't remember the last time he had felt this small, this insignificant. He had tried to humiliate her, to make an example out of her, and now he was the one who was being humiliated. The students, who had once hung on his every word, now saw him in a different light. He was no longer the authoritative figure he had once been. He was just a man who had made a huge mistake. Emma, on the other hand, had become something more than just a student. She had become a symbol of quiet strength and resilience, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. She had proven that being quiet didn't mean being weak. Being humble didn't mean being invisible. And as the professor stood there, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left, Emma sat back down, her focus already shifting to the next challenge ahead. She wasn't interested in the praise. She wasn't interested in the attention. All she wanted was to keep learning, to keep growing. And as for the professor, he knew that today, he had learned a lesson that would stick with him for a long time. The next few days passed by in a blur for Emma. The once silent and unnoticed student had now become the center of attention. Word had spread quickly about what had happened in Professor Harrington's class. Some of the students were in awe, while others felt a sense of embarrassment for having laughed at her just days before. Emma, however, remained unchanged. She still sat in the back of the class, quietly taking notes, but now there was a new level of respect from her peers. No one dared to underestimate her again. It was the same for the professor. Every time he glanced at Emma during the next few lectures, he felt a mixture of admiration and regret. He had tried to belittle her, to prove his superiority, but in doing so, he had only exposed his own arrogance and ignorance. There were moments when he caught her eye, and she simply nodded, acknowledging his silent apology without saying a word. He knew, deep down, that he would never make the same mistake again. The classroom dynamic had shifted. Professor Harrington found himself questioning his own methods, his own beliefs about who deserved respect and who didn't. He had always believed that students had to earn their respect, but Emma had shown him that respect should be given freely, without conditions. One day, during a particularly difficult lecture on advanced calculus, Emma raised her hand. The entire class fell silent, and for a moment, Professor Harrington hesitated. He had grown used to Emma's quiet demeanor and had begun to appreciate her unspoken brilliance. "Yes, Emma," he asked, his voice careful, almost reverent. Emma stood up, walked to the front, and began to explain the solution to a problem that had stumped even the best students in the room. She spoke clearly and confidently, her voice steady and calm. The students watched, amazed at how effortlessly she solved the problem, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. Professor Harrington watched her, a sense of pride swelling inside him. She wasn't just a student anymore. She had become something more. She had become a symbol of quiet strength and unacknowledged genius, and he was proud to have witnessed it. As Emma finished her explanation and returned to her seat, the room erupted into applause. It was a spontaneous gesture of respect and admiration from the students, who now saw her for who she truly was. Emma, as always, remained humble, offering a simple smile before returning to her work. She didn't need the applause. She didn't need the recognition. For her, the satisfaction came from solving the problem, from the joy of learning. Professor Harrington stood at the front of the class, silently watching as the students slowly returned to their work. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he had learned something far more important than any calculus problem. He had learned to see people for who they really were, not just by their appearances or the assumptions he had made about them. Emma had shown him that. And in that moment, he understood that true greatness wasn't about standing in the spotlight. It was about quietly doing the work, staying true to oneself, and letting the results speak for themselves. As the weeks passed, Emma's reputation grew. Her quiet confidence, her ability to solve problems with such ease, had earned her the respect of not only her classmates, but also the faculty. Professor Harrington, once the person who had mocked her, now saw her in a completely different light. He watched as she continued to excel in her studies, never seeking attention, never asking for praise, yet always rising above every challenge. He began to understand what made her so exceptional, not just her intelligence, but her humility and dedication. One afternoon, as the semester was nearing its end, Professor Harrington called Emma to his office. It was an unexpected request, one that sent a ripple of curiosity through the students. Emma wasn't one for the spotlight, and the professor knew this. He had heard the whispers, seen how she avoided being singled out. When she entered his office, she sat down across from him, her posture calm, as always. "Emma," he began, his voice hesitant, "I've been thinking a lot about you recently." She looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "I don't think I ever properly apologized," he said, his tone softer than usual, "for the way I treated you at the beginning of the semester. I was wrong. I underestimated you, and I let my ego get in the way." Emma nodded, but said nothing. She had forgiven him long ago, but she didn't feel the need to say it out loud. He continued, "You're more than just a student. You've shown me a great deal about patience, about not judging people based on their appearances or their quietness. I wanted to say thank you." Emma's expression remained neutral, but a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "You don't need to thank me," she said quietly. I just do what I love. The professor looked at her, impressed by her humility. You know, Emma, he said, I've taught for many years, and I've encountered many brilliant students. But your approach to learning, your quiet strength, it's something I don't see every day. She looked at him, her eyes steady. I don't do it for recognition, she replied. I do it because I enjoy learning. And I believe that's enough. The professor paused, taking in her words. He had expected a different response, perhaps one filled with pride or gratitude, but Emma's simple honesty was something he couldn't quite grasp. She wasn't seeking validation. She wasn't looking for praise. She had already found fulfillment in her work. As Emma left his office that day, Professor Harrington felt a deep sense of respect for her. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that went far beyond any textbook or equation. He had learned that true greatness wasn't about boasting or seeking applause. It was about quietly doing the work, staying focused, and letting the results speak for themselves. That afternoon, as he watched Emma walk away, he realized that, in many ways, she had taught him more than he could ever teach her. She had shown him the power of humility, the strength in silence, and the brilliance that can often go unnoticed. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly grateful to have her as his student. As the semester drew to a close, Emma's life began to shift in ways she hadn't expected. She had always been content with her quiet routine, but now, there was a sense of recognition that followed her wherever she went. Students who once ignored her now approached her for help, seeking her insights on complex problems. She had become a kind of silent leader in the classroom, her actions speaking louder than any words ever could. Professor Harrington, still grappling with his own realizations, had grown even more attentive to Emma's abilities. He found himself going beyond the textbooks, asking her thoughts on new problems he hadn't yet solved. It was a small shift, but to Emma, it meant the world. She wasn't looking for validation, but this mutual respect, even without words, was something she cherished deeply. One day, as the final exam approached, Emma found herself walking into the classroom early, as she always did. The room was still and quiet, with only a few students sitting in the back, reviewing notes. Emma didn't need to study the way they did. She had already committed the lessons to memory, and now, it was just about keeping herself sharp. The professor entered a few minutes later, as he usually did, but today, he seemed different. He wasn't walking with the same arrogance that had once characterized his steps. He was walking with purpose, but there was something in his demeanor that seemed more humble. When he reached the front of the class, he turned and looked at Emma for a brief moment. Good morning, Emma, he said, his voice calm but sincere. She looked up from her notebook and nodded in return. Good morning, Professor, she said softly. It wasn't a groundbreaking conversation, but the way he acknowledged her presence spoke volumes. It wasn't about how much he had learned from her, or how much she had learned from him. It was the recognition that came. With mutual respect, the rest of the class began trickling in, and the atmosphere felt different. There was no tension, no subtle competition. Everyone simply sat down, prepared for the exam. As the test began, Emma glanced around the room. Her classmates, who had once sneered at her quiet nature, were now immersed in their work, all of them aware, in their own ways, that Emma had something they could never match. The professor, too, seemed more at ease, his gaze occasionally drifting to her, but no longer with the scrutiny he once held. He had learned something far more valuable than the equations on the board. He had learned that greatness doesn't always scream for attention. It doesn't demand a spotlight or recognition. Greatness is quiet, humble, and earned in the stillness. After the exam, as the class packed up to leave, Professor Harrington caught up with Emma. I wanted to say one more thing, he began, his tone thoughtful. I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. Thank you for everything. You've taught me more than any textbook ever could. Emma smiled, but her answer was simple, just like her. I'm just here to learn, Professor. With that, she left the room, her presence felt by everyone, but only those who truly looked beyond the surface could understand the depth of her quiet strength. As the months passed, Emma continued her studies, undistracted by the attention she had received earlier. Her focus remained on the work itself, not on the recognition or praise. It was during one of the final weeks of the semester when the class was preparing for their last major project that something unexpected happened. Professor Harrington approached her after class one day, his expression serious but thoughtful. "Emma," he said, "I've been thinking about something. I've been observing how you work and how you interact with the material, and I can't help but think that you should consider going beyond this classroom." Emma looked at him, a bit confused but intrigued. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice calm and composed as always. "You have a talent, a gift that goes beyond the average student," he said. "You've shown me that there's more to learning than just following the rules, than just completing assignments. You're not just solving problems. You're thinking in a way that most people don't. And I believe you could do more with that." Emma considered his words carefully, not sure what to say. It wasn't that she hadn't thought about what lay beyond her current path, but she had never felt the need to seek out more. She had always been content with the quiet, steady pace of her own growth. "I don't need more recognition," she said softly. "I'm here because I want to learn, not because I want to stand out." Professor Harrington nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I know, and that's why I'm telling you this. You don't have to go looking for attention, but you deserve the opportunity to be more than just another student. Your potential isn't something that should be hidden." Emma's mind raced as she considered his words. She had always kept to herself, staying out of the spotlight. She had never sought validation from anyone, not even from those who underestimated her. But the professor was right. She had worked hard, and maybe it was time to stop hiding that work behind the curtain of silence. "Thank you, Professor," she said finally, a small smile on her face. "But I'm still not sure what that means for me." "It means," he said, his voice steady, "that you have the chance to make a difference, to show others what you're capable of. You don't need to do it for anyone else. Do it for yourself. You've proven to me that true strength doesn't shout for attention. But sometimes, it's worth letting others see what you've worked so hard for." The conversation lingered with Emma long after she left his office that day. She spent the next few days reflecting on what he had said. She had spent so much time focusing on learning for the sake of learning, for the sake of her own growth, that she had never considered sharing her work with others. It wasn't about boasting or seeking admiration. It was about showing that quiet strength, that humble brilliance, and letting others learn from it. The semester ended, and Emma found herself at a crossroads. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to hide who she was anymore. She had already proven to herself what she was capable of, and now, it was time to see how far she could go. As the summer break began, Emma found herself contemplating the next chapter of her life. The quiet confidence she had built over the past months had transformed her. She no longer felt the need to hide her abilities or blend into the background. Professor Harrington's words echoed in her mind. You deserve the opportunity to be more than just another student. But what did that mean for her? Emma had always been content with simply learning, solving problems, and going unnoticed. She had never aspired to anything more. But now, after everything that had happened, she wasn't so sure. It was a difficult decision. She had no desire for fame or recognition, but the idea of sharing her knowledge with others, of perhaps guiding others who were in the same position she once was, began to grow on her. She had always believed that the quiet work spoke for itself, but maybe there was more to it. One afternoon, as Emma sat in the library, reflecting on her thoughts, her phone buzzed. It was an email from a renowned research institute offering an internship. The subject line read, "Invitation to apply for a prestigious internship in advanced mathematics." Emma stared at the screen, unsure of how to respond. The opportunity was enormous, but it felt so far removed from the quiet, humble life she had built for herself. Yet, there was something about it that pulled her in. Maybe it was time to take the next step, to see how far her quiet strength could take her. Emma pondered for a long time before finally responding. She would apply, not because she wanted the recognition or because she sought validation, but because it was time to see what she was truly capable of. The application process was rigorous, but Emma attacked it with the same focus she had brought to everything else in her life. Weeks later, she received the acceptance letter. The institute had chosen her, and they were eager to have her join their team. Emma was overwhelmed with a sense of accomplishment, but also with a bit of fear. This was a big step, one that would push her out of her comfort zone. But that was exactly what she needed. As the start date for the internship approached, Emma prepared herself for the challenge. She knew that this experience would test her in ways she hadn't imagined, but she was ready. When the day finally came, she walked into the institute with her head held high, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She wasn't looking for a trophy or for anyone to sing her praises. She was there to learn, to grow, and to see how far her abilities could take her. The work ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, Emma was excited about what the future held. She was no longer just a quiet girl in the back of the classroom. She was someone with something to offer, and it was time for the world to see that. And as she sat down at her new desk, ready to dive into the world of advanced mathematics, Emma knew that this was only the beginning. As Emma settled into her internship at the Research Institute, she found herself immersed in a world that was both challenging and invigorating. The work was complex, the problems much harder than anything she had encountered before, but she felt alive in a way she never had in the classroom. Her colleagues were brilliant, all of them accomplished in their respective fields, and Emma couldn't help but feel a little out of place at first. But as the days passed, she realized that she was more than capable of handling the work. Her quiet strength, the one that had carried her through all these years, was now her greatest asset. She approached every task with the same dedication she had shown in her studies, never seeking the spotlight, but always performing at her best. Her colleagues started to notice. At first, it was subtle, a glance here, a word of praise there. But as Emma's contributions became more visible, they grew in appreciation. It wasn't just her skill that impressed them, but her humility, her ability to work quietly behind the scenes, without ever seeking recognition. She wasn't one to boast or brag. She simply did the work. One afternoon, as Emma was working through a particularly difficult set of equations, one of her colleagues, Daniel, came over to her desk. "Emma, I just wanted to say, we've all been impressed with how you approach problems. You're different, you know," he said, his tone sincere. Emma looked up, slightly surprised by the compliment. "I'm just doing my part," she replied, her voice calm as always. Daniel smiled. "I know, but it's more than that. It's the way you think, the way you approach things. You're not just solving problems. You're changing the way we look at them." Emma nodded, feeling a sense of pride in his words, but she didn't dwell on them. It wasn't about the praise. It was about the work. As the months went by, Emma's role in the project grew. She was no longer just another intern. She was becoming a key player, trusted with tasks that others relied on her to solve. And still, she stayed true to herself. She didn't seek attention, didn't try to stand out. She just worked. Then one day, as the team gathered to present their latest findings, Emma was asked to speak. It wasn't something she had anticipated, and for a moment, she hesitated. But then she realized that this was her chance to share the work she had done, to show how far she had come. As she stood before her colleagues, she wasn't nervous. She simply explained the process, the solutions she had worked out, with the same quiet confidence she had always maintained. When she finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. It wasn't a grand standing ovation, but it was enough. Emma had earned their respect, not through boasting or demanding attention, but through hard work and humility. After the presentation, Professor Harrington, who had been observing from the back of the room, approached her. "Emma," he said, his voice warm, "I knew you had it in you. I'm proud of you. You've truly come into your own." Emma smiled, but again, she didn't need to say much. She had already proven everything she needed to prove. And in that moment, standing there among colleagues who respected her not for her quietness, but for her brilliance, Emma knew that she had found her place. The world had finally seen her for who she truly was, not just a quiet girl in the back of the room, but a force to be reckoned with.